Welcome to this week's episode of the Readout LOUD, a weekly biotech podcast from STAT. I'm Allison DeAngelis.
I'm Adam Forrestein.
And I'm Damian Garde.
It's Thursday, August 24th, and here's what we're going to talk about this week.
The world is suddenly taking notice of Vivek Ramaswamy, the biotech executive turned presidential candidate. We discuss how he went from a drug industry entrepreneur to a GOP rising star and how his former biotech colleagues are reacting to it.
We'll also talk about the latest news in the life sciences, including a curious data leak and the family business of a famed biotech inventor.
All that after a word from our sponsor.
Hi, I'm Shirley Leung. I'm a columnist for the Boston Globe. I want to tell you about a new podcast that I'm hosting. It's called Say More. On Say More, I'll be talking to the doers and thinkers behind the biggest ideas of our time. How business works, how cities thrive, politics, technology, culture. I want to bring you inside those conversations. Say More, a new podcast from Boston Globe Opinion. Find it wherever you listen to podcasts.
So, Damian, I was not attuned to my TV set last night, but you were watching the first Republican debate and our, biotech, some call him friend, some call him foe, Vivek. Tell us about, what kind of impression he made on the crowd last night.
It was interesting. I mean, I guess it's worth pointing out. I mean, this is something you two know very well, and probably people listening to this can imagine. We don't always get to choose what we cover in this line of work. And so I am not a politics reporter, but I was assigned to specifically watch Vivek Ramaswamy because I know him, we know him, people listening to this probably know him as we mentioned at the top, a biotech entrepreneur of some renown, or at least of a lot of interest, dating back to around 2015. He has since left the biotech company that he founded and run for president, obviously. And so, we kind of had been keeping tabs on his rise sort of through that lens. We don't, the three of us don't cover presidential campaigns generally, but here was kind of someone biotech perceived, the biotech community, I guess, to the extent such thing exists, as one of its own, running for president. And he largely as a long shot candidate. He was polling, below 1% sort of Connor Roy numbers for a while, but those numbers had begun to change in recent weeks. And that all culminated, I think, on Wednesday night where, at least from my view, he distinguished himself from the rest of the candidates on stage running for president, not including, of course, Donald Trump, who was not there. And I think in the reaction that I've seen publicly, that the world, as we said, is kind of waking up saying, who is this man? I mean, so what I ended up writing, reaching for an angle, because of course I had been assigned to write something, was that, and I do stand by this. It occurred to me that the reaction to him on stage, both in the room in Milwaukee, where he was often greeted, I think, warmly by cheers, and then occasionally had to shout over boos, was polarizing, both in the room and on Twitter, and I think just kind of among people watching the debate. And it called to mind the way that we all first became aware of Vivek within biotech back in 2015, when he was this 29-year-old former hedge fund manager with a bold idea that, in his very well-spoken but also very, very confident description, had basically figured out how to do drug development. The underlying implication was that the major incumbents, the Pfizers and Mercks of the world, were getting it all wrong, and that he and his team, these sort of brash outsiders with youth and inexperience as conceivably a virtue, were going to do it the right way. And I heard echoes of that, not talking about biotech, obviously, but about foreign policy and about just how to run the United States. And so it was kind of interesting to watch on a much larger scale some applause in the room and some praise on the internet, but also some mockery, some derision, and some people taking offense at that brashness as applied to his presidential campaign. Because, as we probably remember, Adam, I know you do, he was greeted with some praise and also some mocking and derision back in 2015 as well.
Yeah. So, Damian, I watched I don't know, about an hour or so of the debate last night. I kind of turned it off around 10 o'clock or so. So I saw a lot of the clips that you're probably seeing this morning. I got to see live last night. I mean, no one really cares about my political analysis, but I kind of think he won the debate last night, mainly because, winner being defined as like the person who is being most talked about or at the sort of center of all the attention at a debate like this. And he seemed to be, like you said, whether he was getting applause or getting boos. I mean, people were paying attention to Vivek, and that was probably what he wanted. And so I kind of think he won with that, in that regard. But yeah, I mean, I think the persona that you see on the stage or you saw on the stage last night is, like you said, Damien, is sort of the same persona that we encountered when, you and I probably started talking to him back in the 2014, 2015, 2016 time period, when he started Roivant, again, going back to the name, right? Roivant, ROI, return on investment, right? That was that was the sort of the kicker in terms of the name he gave his company. And then obviously, the Alzheimer's drug that he acquired from GSK for $5 million, which he magically spun into a $1 billion publicly traded company. He had that. I think the term you used was brashness. He was, and that's kind of what you saw last night. I mean, there's probably a fine line between being brash and being arrogant or being too much of a smart aleck. And so maybe if there was criticism of last night, he did come across that way a little bit. And clearly there are some other candidates on that stage that do not like him for that. But I guess that was my general impression of him.
Yeah, I got a text message this morning from a friend who is not in the biotech world. Very specifically was like, Allison, what do you know this biotech guy who's running for president? Like, that was in the debates last night. It does feel like everybody's talking about him. And as much like derision as he kind of, inspired, when Roivant was started, it's funny to like look now on paper, as you pointed out, Damien, in your article. They have 6 FDA approved drugs for this company that's not even 10 years old, and are now there's now M&A chatter surrounding Roivant and its subsidiaries. I don't quite know what to make of him. I mean, what I saw of, kind of biotech Twitter last night was a, general sweeping, dislike of Vivek.
Well, yeah. I mean, let's be real, right? I mean, most people that I don't want to say most. It's so hard to generalize here, but a lot of people on bio Twitter and the people that you see criticizing Vivek are, on the sort of liberal side of the political spectrum. So, naturally, you're not going to like Vivek for his positions, and that's fine. But I think getting back maybe more to the sort of the substance of it. I mean, I think people I think took issue with, it didn't come up at the debate last night, but people have taken issue with his recent criticisms of the FDA, for instance.
Yeah.
Matt Herper and I sort of we wrote a column analysis piece about some of the things that Vivek has said about the way the FDA does things. He basically called the agency corrupt, and and it's sort of what he said sort of had a healthy serving of that kind of MAGA red meat type of material, and there wasn't maybe a ton of substance to what he said. And I think people within the industry certainly take offense of that, and legitimately so. It's interesting that he seems to want to dismantle the FDA. That's very much kind of on the libertarian side of his political philosophy. Most biopharma and drug company executives that you talk to actually want a strong FDA, right? I mean, Damien, you and I were talking about that just the other day.
Yeah, it's curious because in the, zooming out and looking at him as an outsider businessman, Republican presidential candidate, that in itself is not like a novel phenotype. Obviously, Donald Trump being the most proximate and most successful example, probably, at least in recent history. But when you look at those people, they tend to come in with policies that would prove to be beneficial to the industries from whence they came. Obviously the Bush-Cheney administration coming from oil and natural gas, Donald Trump as sort of like emissary of rich real estate guys. The Trump tax cuts were advantageous to people from that demographic. Vivek as like a pretty like true blue libertarian, at least based on what he said, promising to gut the FDA is curious because, Adam, as you mentioned, I mean, the drug industry, there's sort of like a prisoner's dilemma kind of vibe with the FDA. So like if you're a drug company, obviously it would be best for your bottom line if the FDA took it really easy on your drug specifically, and approved it really quickly, and then you could start selling it. That would be great. However, if the FDA took it that easy on everybody else, it means some other company that invested maybe less money with a drug that maybe doesn't work as well would likewise be able to win approval, compete with your drug, and cut into those profits. So as a whole, the drug industry tends to favor a well-funded and pretty strong gatekeeping FDA because it is key to their ability to make the kind of returns that a successful drug can make. So if Vivek were to be elected president, we can talk about the actual odds of that later. But anyway, just taking him at his word, if he wanted to gut the FDA, it would probably be disastrous for the industry that he comes from, which is kind of an interesting, I don't know, it differentiates him, I guess, in some ways from other candidates of this type that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, and we should say that those issues that are sort of core to this podcast, core to sort of health, I mean, those didn't really come up. Abortion came up, but Vivek, I don't think, Damien, you probably watched the whole thing, but I don't think Vivek really chimed in on the abortion question during that portion of the debate.
Right. It wasn't posed to him. He has in the past said that it's sort of a leave it to the states kind of thing. Again, tacking to the sort of libertarian ethos.
I mean, I did, Allison, you mentioned, hearing from people outside and, about Vivek. And I did, because I know somebody, a longtime sort of friend source of mine who, very, I would say, sort of very, very libertarian / conservative in the healthcare world. He's an investor. And I did ask him, I was just curious the other day, asked him what he thought of Vivek. And he really likes the guy. I mean, again, it's mostly because of the sort of the libertarian policies that Vivek espouses and, I guess would implement or try to implement if he ever became president. And I think that appeals to this person that I know. And, I think he chimed in with me last night. I asked him watch the debate and let me know what you think. And he also thought Vivek did really well. So, I mean, I know when Vivek entered the race, guys, we always debated should we take it seriously? Should we be covering him? He comes from our world. And I don't know, Damien, it sounds like you're going to get more assignments to write about Vivek in the future. You might be going on the campaign trail, my friend.
Yeah, you mentioned at the start that he, for the longest time kind of entered and he was, polling at, Connor Roy levels. Where is he at now? Obviously, we don't have any... There's not much, or there's limited polling post debate last night, but kind of heading into this, where is he standing nationally?
Yeah, I'm curious to see what the effects of his seeming star turn will be. But coming into this, I'd seen him at around 7% nationally, which that's a single digit number, but he was gaining on Ron DeSantis, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is sort of the presumed second place nominee after Donald Trump, who is washing all of these candidates by 40 points, but that's another matter. But anyway, Vivek seemed to be gaining not only on DeSantis, but in some polls surpassing him in the early primary and caucus states, which I think was driving a lot of, there was a leaked memo last week purportedly authored by advisors to Ron DeSantis, advising him to attack Vivek specifically, which he didn't really do last night. But I think that was read as an implication that Vivek's opponents were starting to take him seriously. And I think, Vice President Mike Pence and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie did seem to come out swinging for Vivek last night. That might be reflective of what seemed like their personal taking of offense at his manner, but it also seemed kind of preordained, perhaps, in that those guys are polling pretty low and look at him as maybe someone to take down a notch. And I'll be very curious not only what the polling looks like in the aftermath of the debate, but also what the next debate looks like, because to the extent that Adam, to your point about how it felt like Vivek won because coming in with relatively low expectations with probably the lowest name recognition, he does seem to be kind of leading news coverage after the fact. that element of surprise is gone now. You only get that once. And so in the next debate, we'll see what the Christie campaign, the Pence campaign, the Haley campaign, quite likely, have dug up and want to throw in his face the next time they get a chance to do so.
I did like the Chat GPT line that Christie threw at him. That was kind of fun.
Yeah. Damien, you mentioned that leaked memo. We had our own little leak in the biopharma world this week at a Genentech and Roche. Adam, can you kind of lead us through what the heck happened? I'm not ready for an era. It's the end of August, guys. I'm not ready for like a leaked, documents conversation. I'm ready for my last vacation of the summertime.
So we're gonna go from Vivek to Tidget, is what you're saying, Allison, in that wonderful transition to another topic, because we've talked about Vivek way more than we should have. So anyway, awesome. Thank you for doing that. It was really kind of funny.
I mean, we could talk about, I don't know, we could throw in Biogen. Do we have anything Biogen to talk about?
Kind of everyone's I think everyone is just looking forward to the August, or maybe taking some time off and coming back to the real world in September. But yes, this leak that we referenced it was kind of fascinating. Apparently, some internal slides at Genentech, inside Genentech, regarding data on its TIGIT, which is a class of immunotherapy drugs that are under development. So a slide that depicts an interim analysis of this very closely followed phase 3 study of an anti-TIGIT drug called tiragolumab. We'll just call it maybe we'll just call it tiragolumab, whatever. But it leaked. Apparently, somebody at Genentech posted this slide on a public-facing or publicly accessible portion of their website. And Umar Rafat, who's an analyst at Evercore ISI, apparently found this slide and then published it in a research note, which got everybody buzzing about kind of TIGIT and whether or not this was kind of a target that people thought was maybe not dead, but was certainly there was a lot of doubts about this, at the activity of these TIGIT compounds. Now there's renewed interest in it. I have to give a shout out to Jared Holtz at Mizuho, biotech strategist. We've had him on this podcast many times. He had a great line in a note about this, and referring to Umar Rafat's finding of this slide. He said, really nice find by biopharma analysts refreshing the Roche website like Ticketmaster at midnight of a Taylor concert drop. Which I really did like. But I mean, the TLDR of all this is that, TIGIT, a lot of people thought TIGIT was dead as an immunotherapy target. And now maybe it's back. There was another great line. Akash Tiwari, who is an analyst at Jefferies, the headline on his research note on this was Schrodinger's TIGIT, both a signal and not a signal. And I think that summed it up well, because it's like, depending on how you looked at it and how you looked at the data and your point of view, and maybe whether you owned any of these TIGIT stocks or not, you saw great things, or maybe you saw nothing at all.
Yeah, the whole TIGIT, the whole TIGIT roller coaster.
I say TIGIT, you can say TIGIT, and we can,
I'm not pronouncing the
cover all
name.
the bases.
That was plainly beyond me.
Let's call the whole thing off.
This whole roller coaster, I mean, to your point about it being super promising, then questionable, then seemingly left for dead, and now kind of reemerging. I mean, we've done this before. I remember a similar cycle ending in abandonment for a target called IDO, which once upon a time was meant to be the next big thing in immuno-oncology. And it just gets to, for really now like a decade, after the initial great excitement over PD-1 and PD-L1 checkpoint inhibitors, the drugs like Keytruda and Opdivo, we had this thought of like, wow, this, immuno-oncology is moving at such an advanced pace. All these other new targets seem to exist. There was a unquantifiable, seemingly, number of clinical trials combining new things with the things we knew worked. And it seemed like the dawn of this bright new era where there would be mix and match therapies that would change the face of oncology, really, and provide hope to many patients with tumor types that had not been amenable to some of the drugs that we knew worked. And I mean, it feels much more like that scientists have been throwing spaghetti at a wall, more or less, for about a decade, and there isn't that much to show for it. I mean, maybe perhaps the Tiggett story has a happy ending and the conversation will change, but it is just a kind of a reminder of what a slog this has sort of been scientifically.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking kind of in the Stat Newsroom about, this year we're actually seeing like a dip in investment in oncology startups. I think primarily because of what you're saying, Damien, that like we have just invested so heavily over the last decade and don't really have all that much arguably to show for it. And, oncology, I think is like still one of the, is still the most active area in biotech investing. But like, it looks like there is some sort of like softness to those numbers that's emerging. I don't know. Will we see a whole sweep of Tiggett investment? Who knows?
You saw that there was a pretty widespread stock reaction to this Roche Genentech news this week. You saw companies like Gilead and Arcus who are co-developing their own TIGIT drug. Merck has got one. A small, tiny drug maker called Iteos is partnered with GSK. They've got one. So you saw all of these, the stocks of all these companies go up because of this renewed optimism for what might be the future of TIGIT.
So finally, we got some news on famed biotech inventor, in fact, superlatively perhaps most cited scientist in the history of science, Robert Langer, and more specifically, his family. Allison, what is transpiring within the extended Langer household?
Yeah, so we have a new Langer project. I found out through the grapevine that Bob's son, Michael, who for the last several years was, kind of a higher up executive at Pear Therapeutics, the digital health company that went bankrupt this spring. Michael is getting together with Pear's former CEO, Corey McCann, and they have a new VC firm that they are starting and are currently raising money for called TRX. Similarly to kind of the TIGIT story, I was like,
how do you pronounce that?
I'm curious, is it T-Rex or is it TRX? T.RX?
Because as I look at your story, Allison, it's T.RX. And
right, it looks like a
RX
vanity
small.
URL. I was confused by that.
Yeah, that's an interesting name.
Yeah, it is. And we will, the firm hasn't officially like launched. So I will don't worry, I'll be following up with Michael and Corey about which pronunciation is correct. But yeah, new investment firm that will work in both therapeutics and digital health. And Michael has brought in his father, Bob Langer, the aforementioned serial founder of, I think, 40 plus startups. Robert's going to be a scientific advisor at the firm. And, the what I've kind of heard is that part of the pitch is that the firm will have early access to the next, Langer companies and the Langer startups that come into the biotech space. So, yeah, new project in the Langer household.
So, Allison, you said in your story they raised about, I think, $175 million for the first fund.
That's the cap for their first fund.
Is that what?
Yeah, which they're raising right now.
Is that a lot, a little? Like, what is that for funds?
I mean, like a first fund in biotech is usually more modest. I think, we see some variation depending on kind of like the pedigree of investor and like, what their background is. Like we saw earlier this year, the guys who founded this new firm called Dimension, who had come, two of them were kind of acolytes of Josh Wolf. They had come out of Lux Capital and were very involved in the therapeutics arm at Lux. They left and formed their own fund, which was more in like they formed their own firm. The first fund was more in the like $300 million range. I had kind of heard that, T.RX was looking to raise a little bit more. They have said that their cap is 175, so we'll see where they end up landing. But it's a modest amount for a first fund for, I think two people whose long-term venture Pear, didn't really pan out the way that they hoped it to.
It's interesting, as you mentioned, a large part of the value proposition, maybe all of the value proposition, is the proximity to Bob Langer and the chance to get in on the ground floor on whatever he comes up with next. But as you point out in your story, he has a very long and lucrative relationship with Polaris Ventures, a larger and more established venture capital firm in Boston, or probably there around the world. So how does that shake up? Like how do we divide the mind of Bob Langer such that there is Bob to go around for these various ventures?
Yeah, one of the things about the biotech world is that, you'll see entrepreneurs and founders have kind of very close relationships with certain firms, but very rarely is that one firm writing the entire check for a round. So I asked around the ecosystem and people who kind of former Polaris folks, people who know Polaris well, and they said that from their point of view, it's really unlikely that this will impact Bob's kind of relationship with Polaris, and kind of cause any sort of tension there. And in fact, Michael Langer had said that T.RX and Polaris have, I think he called it, an informal but close relationship. So it sounds like we will see the two of them, those two firms, kind of writing checks alongside each other in the next, Bob Langer ventures.
So Allison, I have heard, can't confirm this, but I have heard that the Langer family not exactly happy with Stat because of some recent coverage. Did that come up when you talked to Michael Langer? Am I putting you in an uncomfortable position? I don't know. I just thought
I'm going to open this whole can of worms.
Anyone listening to the end of the podcast will, this is a reward.
So, there was, from what I've heard, I was not involved in this coverage.
Of course you were not.
You would know better.
Of course not. Yeah.
But, the movement in Biogen's board and, the removal of, the departure of Alex Denner and replacement by Susan Langer, Bob Langer's daughter, some of the questions that arose about that apparently, weren't positive, weren't well received in the Langer family,
But good for Michael for putting that in the past and talking to you.
Michael and I honestly didn't really get into that. I've known Michael around the biotech ecosystem in Boston for a few years now, and so it's Susan's not involved in T.RX, and so no, this is Michael's venture.
And with that, another episode of the Readout Loud comes to a close.
Oh, was I meant to? I'm sorry. I thought that was ad-lib. Thank you to Teresa Gaffney for producing this week's episode.
Our senior producers are Hyacinth Empanato and Alyssa Ambrose. Our executive producer is Rick Burke, and our theme music is by Brian Joel.
We'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you like about this week's episode, what you didn't like, and maybe your thoughts about Vivek. You can do all that by sending us an email at readoutloud@statnews.com.
And if you like what we do, leave a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you use to get your podcasts.
We're taking next week off, but we will see you in September.
You've got other companies. Merck has got a TIGIT or TIGIT
we
drug.
We have to settle as a podcast on one.
I'm going to say TIGIT.
Okay.
I'm a TIGIT guy.
I'll say TIGIT.
I'm
okay.
team TIGIT.